Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Writers' Festival. My name's Nick Feik. I'm the editor of the monthly magazine, and it's great to be here. We're talking bigotry in Australia this evening, and initially this session was put together in response to the proposed changes to the Racial Discrimination Act. Clearly that's fallen over now, so Alice and Maxine will be available to sign their books at the back. Thanks very much for coming. No, it was really, when those changes were proposed, it was a pretty sort of horrifying moment, I thought, in public life, where you thought we were being thrown backwards after years of progress on these issues, that we had a government that was completely uninterested in the sorts of advances that have been made. But in retrospect, I think that the recent months' experience actually is quite positive, because the community demonstrated that they were still in charge to some extent, and that they really wouldn't accept the changes that were being proposed. Look, I won't take up too much of your time, because we have two fantastic writers here this evening. Maxine Beneba Clarke, sitting in the middle, is an author and spoken word performer. Her first collection of short fiction, Foreign Soil, won the 2013 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript and was published earlier this year. Her poetry collections include Gil Scott-Heron's On Parole from 2009 and Nothing Here Needs Fixing in 2013. She's currently working on her memoir, The Hate Race. And Alice Pung, who's the main speaker tonight, is the author of Unpolished Gem and Her Father's Daughter, and the editor of the anthology Growing Up Asian in Australia. Alice's work has appeared in The Monthly, Good Weekend, The Age, Best Australian Stories and Meanjin, and her new novel, Lorinda, is due out in November. Alice is going to speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves and then throw it open to the floor. But please welcome Alice to the stage.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. I hope you can see me over this thing that's almost as tall as I am. Thank you for coming to our session on bigotry. I'd like to thank Lisa Dempster, who is Melbourne Writers' Festival, who organised this whole thing. She's made a very inclusive program this year, and Maxine and I feel very proud to be part of the festival. I'd also like to thank my friends Maxine Beneba Clarke and Nick Feik, who's the editor of the monthly magazine, for being here tonight, because I know tonight we're going to have the kind of careful, nuanced conversation about bigotry that we don't seem to currently be having in relation to the former proposed changes to Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act that were proposed by the Attorney General. Now, I say former because they've now been scrapped, but let me give you a little bit of a brief background onto them. On the 25th of March this year, the Australian government actually approved amendments to the Racial Discrimination Act, and the Attorney General stated in Parliament that, and this is the rationale, he said that it is certainly the intention of the government to remove from the Racial Discrimination Act those provisions that enabled the columnist Andrew Bolt to be taken to the federal court merely because he expressed an opinion about a social or political matter. And then he said, I will very soon be bringing forward an amendment to the Racial Discrimination Act which will ensure that this can never happen in Australia again. That is, that never again in Australia will we have a situation in which a person may be taken to court for expressing a political opinion. Now, I'll give you a tiny summary. You probably all know about this case. Andrew Bolt wrote a few years ago some articles claiming that Indigenous Australians, and he named quite a few prominent Indigenous Australians, and he claimed that they were trying to rot our meritocracy by getting jobs, positions and awards by exploiting their Aboriginal heritage, even though they looked to him to be white. So a group of Indigenous Australians whom he had mentioned in this article got together and decided to take the matter to court because their reputations, their jobs and their personal sense of dignity was at stake. My friend Anita Heiss was part of these group of people who took it to court. She's an accomplished writer and academic, one of the plaintiffs, and they won under Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which makes it illegal to offend, humiliate and insult anyone based on their race. And Justice Bromberg, who decided the case, he declared that the manner in which the articles were written contain errors of fact, distortions of truth, and inflammatory and provocative language that reinforced, encouraged, and emboldened prejudiced views. So if you're interested in this, look up Justice Bromberg's decision, and it's a very well-reasoned decision. He balanced the freedoms of speech with, the right not to be vilified. And I've read the decision. At the back of the decision are attached the offending articles, which you can also have a look at. Now, Andrew Bolt, when he came out of court, he declared that it was a sad day for freedom of speech when the decision was handed down, and that's when the proposed changes came in. So the Australian government did approve these amendments, and it was waiting to go to the Senate, and they wanted community consultation, and the government wanted these changes to occur. They wanted to change the existing words offend, humiliate and insult to the stronger vilify and intimidate. And they added another amendment that what constituted vilification and intimidation was to be judged by the standards of the ordinary reasonable Australian and not any particular group in the community. So the ordinary reasonable Australian. So while we're talking about this ordinary reasonable Australian, I like all of us to conduct this conversation in sort of plain language. So if you're a lawyer in the audience, please keep it in a way where we can understand. So I'd also like to begin by using language in the spirit of the Writers' Festival by telling a story. Now, a little while back, I was in the lunchroom of an electrical appliance store, Better Electrical, with some men who were reading the newspaper, and they were all gathered around this newspaper. It was turned to page 17 or 18, and one of the men said to me, "Hey, look here, these terrorists are coming, and they're coming by boat, and we have to stop them. Some of them probably fought with the Taliban. This is really terrible." And I said, "Dad, you've got to stop reading Andrew Bolt in the paper." And my father said, "Oh, but this man, firstly, he writes really well, and secondly, he speaks the truth." Now, my father, his Macedonian, Italian, Vietnamese, Southeast Asian work staff, they admire Andrew Bolt. Are they stupid men? Of course not. There are three things to understand about immigrants in Australia who feel like they must truly belong to this country, who feel like they must be the most patriotic of all patriots, because this country has given them a new life and second chances. The first thing is that English might be their second language, their third language, or their fourth language. So when they read a newspaper like the Herald Sun, it makes perfect sense to them. They can understand every word. And when they read Andrew Bolt does write well, objectively. If you see each sentence, it's a whole paragraph, and each idea is neatly contained in a sentence. And he writes persuasively. The second thing is that these men in the Retrovision store, which is now a Better Electrical, because Retrovision folded. So anyhow, these men have their absolute faith in Australian democracy, and it's a remarkable faith. They believe in democracy and freedom. It's remarkable because they believe that the media never lie. My father's always telling me, you're in a country like Australia, they would never publish lies in the newspapers. This is a free and democratic country, and it's not like bad third world countries from which we came. And the third trait about migrants, especially older generation migrants, is their terrible, deep-seated, visceral fear of terrorism. And this fear is born of personal experience. Now, my father survived the killing fields of Cambodia to come to what he called the lucky country, and anything that threatens the tranquility and safety of our Australian way of life is a threat that must be stopped at all costs. So I'm just going to move this television because I feel like I'm excluding some people in the corner. That's better. I'm so sorry about that. It was in my way. And anyhow, so Prime Minister Abbott, about earlier this month, he decided that he'd scrap these proposed amendments, And he said that he had to work together with the communities of Australia because they were very unhappy with these proposed amendments, these small ethnic enclaves. He didn't say that, but he was saying certain communities were unhappy with the amendments. And I hope when he works with these communities that this is what he means, that he won't go to the most prominent and articulate community leaders, the ones that can convey in proper, unbroken English their message of harmony and goodwill and toleration, because I really think he'd benefit from speaking to men like those in the back of the Better Electrical store, because these men and our Prime Minister actually have a lot in common. They all believe they are reasonable men. They all respect Andrew Bolt, and they all understand fear because they all know how much of a threat fear can be. So when Andrew Bolt comes along and points to reasons why they should be fearing, they believe it. And Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Burma who won the Nobel Peace Prize, said very wisely that it's not power that corrupts, but fear. So how do you determine behaviour or words that incite hatred and cause fear of physical harm, as the proposed amendments were going to affect, as opposed to merely hurting a person's feelings? Because our Attorney General said this is not a country for hurt feelings. This law is to protect genuine incitations of hatred and fear of physical harm. Now, the extreme reactions of my father to racism, to someone who might say, you don't belong here, fear of certain death, fear of revolution, fear of a knock on the door, genuine fear of physical harm due to post-traumatic stress, would be just considered hurt feelings to a person who has never escaped genuine terrorism, never starved and eaten their own leather belt, never had to bury loved ones. Now, fortunately, my father doesn't see casual racism or name-calling to be too much of a threat. He believes he's a reasonable man, so whenever things like that happen, he internalises it. He does all he can to mitigate against these things happening by being quiet in public, by always buying public transport tickets, by working hard, by not making a fuss, by teaching his children to study hard and keep a low profile. Yesterday, one of my students, because I was conducting writing workshops at the Immigration Museum, she was only 16 and she told me this story. She said her cousin was speaking Thai in public at a tram. She didn't even say Thai. She said, he was speaking a different language. This is how ashamed we are of, specific ethnicities we belong to. And she said, and then he got punched in the face. And that was her story. So I found that terrible. He wasn't very lucky. Now, George Brandis, the Attorney General, said when announcing his proposed changes to the Act, in a free country, people do have rights to say things that other people found offensive. So clearly someone had found this man speaking in Thai offensive, but clearly he had the right to speak in Thai, So, yet the man who was punched in the face, the cousin of my 16-year-old student, he probably wasn't even aware he had a right not to be punched in the face. I asked my student if her cousin did anything about it, and she said, nah, what's the point? This is a 16-year-old schoolgirl. Now, at that point, I didn't say to her, hey, my friend, Section 18C exists for you. It protects your legal rights. Can you imagine this poor guy who doesn't even speak good English, which is probably why he was speaking Thai to, his family member, taking something like this to court, using all his money and energy and resources, because broken noses heal, and he'll just make sure he'll be more careful next time. My friend Anita Heiss was exhausted, absolutely deflated after fighting the Andrew Bolt case, that when these proposed amendments came and I said, hey, Anita, do you want to make a submission with me? She said, oh, Alice, I'd love to, but I have no more energy. And yet she did muster the energy to do this. Now, she was part of the Bolt decision, and that was a class action alongside an illustrious and accomplished group of Indigenous Australians. Can you imagine the Indigenous or migrant or poorer individual Australian, an individual by themselves? Most migrants and Indigenous Australians let the casual racism go. Some fights are not worth fighting. They then just learn to move in smaller and smaller circles. This is what racism does to a person. It may not narrow the victim's mind, because my father taught us to think expansively, but it surely does narrow the parameters of their world. Racism creates fear. But you know what? Racism is also born from fear. And very often, these are understandable and realistic fears. I grew up in Braybrook in the 1980s, and in 1983, around that time, there was a terrible recession in Australia, and Braybrook is a very proud working class suburb, a very small suburb of about 8,000 people. When this recession hit, you had old families in Braybrook, like Les Twentyman's family, who had come to Braybrook after World War II, and the men got jobs in the factories, and then, the kids went and finished school at 16 if they weren't studious, and then they got jobs as mechanics or as apprentices or in the factories. So it was a very dignified working class way of life. When the 1980s rolled by and that recession hit, you had a lot of unemployed kids on the street. And my friend Les Twentyman, the social worker, says the kids in Braybrook are different from kids anywhere else. When I visit prisons, and kids from other places look around and they're stunned. They're absolutely bewildered that they've been in prison for the first time. They're scared. And he says, I can always tell a kid from Braybrook because they'll just saunter in, they'll look around, they'll smile, and they say, me old man was in here. Look, there's his name carved on the bench there. And so this sounds funny, but that was Braybrook in the 1980s. And what was interesting about that time was that my mum would walk us home from school, and once this car followed us and its window got wound down and this young man stuck his head out of the window and he said, "Oi, yous, go home, stop stealing our jobs." Now, some of you might be teachers here and you'll tell me that "yous" is not a word, but in Braybrook it means more than two people. So anyhow, my mother turns to me, and when the car puffs away in a cloud of smoke, she says, "What did those boys say to us?" Because she didn't speak much English back then. And I said, "I don't know, Mum," because I was 8 years old. I didn't understand politics. I didn't understand economics. We were about 30 seconds from our front doorstep, so we were going home. And my mum worked as an outworker in the garage, so she wasn't in the factories. And my mum, being a Chinese mum, said, "Oh, I send you to school for so many years." She pinched my ear and she said, "You don't know anything. You can't even explain this to me." And so this was in the 1980s, but school life was very interesting because the teachers were introducing multiculturalism. So we felt pretty good about ourselves at school. We had multicultural food days. We felt included until what happened was about a decade later, the rise of One Nation came. So before she was on Dancing with the Stars, Pauline Hanson, the politician, got up in Parliament and made a maiden speech, and she said that she seemed quite fair at that time, looking back on her maiden speech. I looked back on it recently and thought, this woman is very egalitarian. She's the most fairest politician I've seen of the time, because I'll tell you why. She hated everyone equally. So in that speech, no one was safe from her wrath. The Indigenous, the Asians, the dole bludgers, the middle class, everyone. But she had specific things to say about Asians. She said, they have their own culture and religion, they form ghettos, and they don't assimilate. I'm not making this up. This is in her exact words. And so I would come home from school, and my best friend at that time, her father, we call him, I've changed his name, Uncle Wayne, had loved us since we were little kids. And one day I go to her house and I walk through the front door, and there in her living room is this enormous poster. You might know the poster I'm speaking of. It's Pauline, draped in the Australian flag, looking into the distance. So I saw that poster and I knew exactly what it represented. And I said to her, "Brenna, well, what's this on your wall?" And she was 14 years old. She didn't give a crap about politics. She said, "I don't know, some lady my dad likes, some politician." And I said, but that's bad. And she said, "But I don't give a stuff about, it's just a stupid poster he has." And then Uncle Wayne walks towards me. And I thought, oh no, Uncle Wayne's changed. He's stuck this poster on the wall. He's a One Nation supporter. What am I going to tell my parents? And he said to me, "Hey Alice, I'm glad to see you here. Do you want a cup of Milo?" And I thought, oh, yeah, okay. And he treated us exactly the same. And he was exactly the same man. And it was his fear that led him to stick that poster on the wall. I never got him to remove it because they were his political beliefs, but he still treated us exactly the same and loved us in the same way. And so When we think about race, we don't think about the complexities. We don't think about the Southeast Asian man who loves reading Andrew Bolt. We don't think about the One Nation supporter who loved this group of migrant Cambodian Asian kids in his neighbourhood. What we think about are bogans. We think, oh, these are hateful people. They're the most racist and vilest people who will support these laws. These are the Andrew Bolt readers. But a wonderful writer, you all know him, Christos Tolkis, wrote about our hate of bogans. He said, we like to consider ourselves well-travelled, we are not suspicious of multiculturalism, and we are confident of processing and adjusting to change. At the same time, we rubbish their McMansions, while gentrification makes their inner city life unaffordable, and we castigate them for their cashed-up lack of generosity, while it is in fact their kids mixing with the children of refugees. And that is exactly what I experienced in Braybrook, one of the areas of the lowest socio-economic statuses and the kindest people I knew, people who weren't sensitive, who weren't politically correct, who said very vile things about Asians, but treated us with love. That is such a contradiction. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about literature as an aside, because this is, after all, a writers' festival. Now, many of you would have read the excellent book, The Slap. Now, many of you probably dislike some of the characters in there. They're racist and they're selfish. I've never had a discussion about The Slap with anyone properly, because I find people just want to talk at you about this book. It inflames them. They don't want to talk with you. They just want to condemn the dickheads in there. They like to say, how can this book be so misogynistic? How can this writer be so racist towards his own people, the Greeks? And yet, I don't think it's a racist book. And I don't think it's a book that's full of bigotry, because I've lost a page of my talk where I talk about The Slap. Sorry about that. It's in here somewhere. Okay, I'm going to work without notes. So when people talk about The Slap, they talk about these characters, these vile characters that live in the suburbs, and this doesn't represent multiculturalism, they say. They say, oh, we're friends with our Greek neighbours, or we're friends with our Asian neighbours, and the suburbs of Fitzroy aren't like that, and people don't breastfeed their children until they're 12 or whatever. And what I find most interesting is that when you talk about racism, it's often the writers who write these vile things that get attacked. People say, what's wrong with you, Christos? Why do you write so negatively about your Greek community? He's not writing about his Greek community. He's writing about individuals in his life, fictional individuals that he knows. And these individuals are confronting their own hearts of darkness, as Joseph Conrad wrote about. We all have a heart of darkness. We all have pettiness. We all have these small anxieties, these large insecurities, these jealousies of other people and other things that they might have. And so when Christos Tolkis writes a book about The Slap, we have this vision of what we are as Australians. We're broad-minded, we're open, and the reality confronts with the ideal, and that's what jars people about good literature. Now, the Attorney General, when he proposed these changes, he believed that everyone had an equal voice. He said that, look, if bad ideas spew forth, if you get bad ideas, bigoted ideas, then there will be other ideas to counter these. Now, that's not true, and Maxine and I know very well that's not true, because minority groups are not represented in our society in a true way. I'm just one voice, Maxine is just one voice, and Waleed Ali, when he was talking about the proposed changes to the Racial Discrimination Act, I'd mentioned the reasonable men. And Waleed Ali says, what is this idea of the reasonable person? This is ridiculous, because when you think about the reasonable person, you tend to think of the reasonable person as neutral. When you think of a neutral person, if you have in mind that the person who is reasonable is neutral and that neutrality is white, then you've just given an answer, as to who the reasonable person is. It's a reasonable white man. Now, so we're just three voices, Maxine, Waleed, myself. When we do get a chance to speak, often it's just for the brief soundbite. Sometimes we're lucky to get longer articles in, but this is not often, because long-form journalism, the kind of journalism that Nick advocates in the monthly, the type that considers an issue carefully and insightfully, takes too much time. And that's why publications such as a monthly and Right Now essay series are so important, because by the time you finish writing a long-form journalistic essay, the media have moved on to the next issue and no one cares anymore. Any writer or public person of a minority culture understands this. You're really there for the quick soundbite, and if you write a long-form article and it passes the point of pinnacle interest, then it's over. Our views don't have the same room to breathe. The full story does not often emerge, and when it does, as with the plaintiffs in the Bolt case, when it is allowed to exhale, people dismiss those voices, as for example, in the case of my friend Anita Heiss, as an angry, embittered, successful minority whinger. So we're either good migrants or ungrateful ethnics. So I'm really grateful tonight to be able to show you through story the many contradictions of who we are as people first and foremost. The loving Asian dad, my own, who likes and respects and often agrees with certain political perspectives and Andrew Bolt's writing. The Australian uncle of mine who supports One Nation, my own fears and insecurities as a writer, my admiration for writers like Maxine and Christos, and editors like Nick and Chris Feik. George Brandis, when announcing his proposed changes to the Racial Discrimination Act, said, "Everyone has the right to be a bigot." Now, you know what? In this respect, the chief lawmaker of this country is entirely correct. Anyone has the right to be a bigot. A bigot is someone with fixed and unchanging views. A religious person or a person with convictions can have fixed and unchanging views, but a bigot is something different. A bigot is someone who has fixed and unchanging views based on hate. Legally, you do have a right to be a bigot. You have the right to think hateful things. That's exactly what we did when we read the slap. You hated these characters. Now, whether we want a country that acts on its bigotry is a different matter, which is why I felt compelled with Anita Heiss and many Australians to make a submission to the Attorney General opposing the proposed changes were so heightened when the whole literary, artistic and publishing community got on board and supported our efforts. Nick signed the petition, Alex Miller wrote for it, Arnold Zabel, illustrators, lecturers, academics, actors and directors in this country. Now, when the proposed changes were dropped in early August, the Prime Minister said, "I'm a passionate supporter for free speech, and if we were starting from scratch with Section 18C, we wouldn't have words such as offend and insult in the legislation, but we aren't starting from scratch. We're dealing with a situation we find ourselves in, and I want the communities of the country to be our friend and not our critic. I want to work with the communities of our country as Team Australia here." So he was saying there were some small agitators, little enclaves of ethnic discontent in this country that oppose the law. But the reality is, if it were only those people, the government wouldn't give a toss about these small, relatively insignificant, weaker minorities. It was mainstream Australia. It was all of us saying, you may have a right to be a bigot, but you do not have the right to publicly act on it when there is such an imbalance of power. Bigotry is about fear, it's about class, it's about doubt, it's about deep insecurity and shame. It's not just about racism. People are not their thoughts, and thinking is not a crime. But people are their actions, and our actions should be greater than our fears. This is the most difficult thing to do, but it is a brave thing, and it is the right thing to do. And I hope one day for a government whose actions will be larger than its fears. Thank you so much.
Alice, what a great speech. I'll give, while you get your breath back, I thought I might throw to Maxine for a moment. That it's since become famous or infamous that George Brandis in Parliament said people do have a right to be bigots, you know. Mm-hmm. What was your personal response, and whose rights were you concerned at that moment?
Well, I think my surprise was that, you know, there was no discussion really of how these laws came about, and of the fact that, you know, the basis of human rights law is protecting people who are weak. You know, it's not about protecting people who are in a position of privilege. And I think that's what I was most surprised about, that, you know, that this is human rights law we're talking about. And in a sense, it's not about how far we can push things in the other direction. It's about the kind of society that we want to see and the kind of people that we should be protecting as a society. What were your immediate thoughts about why they did it? Look, I think I believe it was kind of for the popular vote, and I think that kind of xenophobia, as we've seen, you know, with Pauline Hanson, it does, in a sense, galvanise certain groups of people, and I think it really was an appeal to kind of really, you know, a lowest common denominator appeal to the public. In retrospect, it was a terrible underestimation of the Australian community, because there was no support really for them. I mean, Andrew Bolt suddenly looked like the rump of this strange sort of libertarian movement. Alice, you this idea of a reasonable person, do you know, the political opponents of this said that it was like they were licensing racist language. And you raised the idea that, as your dad says, Andrew Bolt's a reasonable man. Where do you sit in relation? Is he a reasonable man who's misguided, or did you think it was an actively sort of aggressive thing to do?
That's a good question, Nick, because we all believe we're reasonable people. That was a part of the talk that I lost, that I was trying to speak about. Everyone believes that they're a reasonable person. I know that inside the mind of Andrew Bolt, he probably believes that he's speaking to reason. He just probably doesn't do as much thorough research as a journalist should do when they're writing their reasonable arguments down. So anyone could write arguments, and everyone has an opinion on something. If your opinions are not founded on fact, then they're lies. That's clear and simple. That's what they are. And the real danger of this is that if you're publishing these lies through the media, if you're vilifying other people, and others who have absolute faith in the Australian media, especially those not that well educated, the people we call bogans, the people we call working class, the people who are migrants, who read the Herald Sun, they believe these lies. Yes.
Alice wrote this fantastic piece about about her father and in relation to this. Did you actually speak to him and explain to him your reading, and did he eventually come round and see that there was an element of racism or a sort of aggression that didn't serve his ends?
Sorry, Nick. What do you mean?
In relation to the proposed changes and Bolt's support of them?
We never talked about the proposed changes. My father did talk about terrorism, you know, because there's big cartoons in the Herald Sun of black-clad people coming on boats, and that terrifies him. No, I don't think we ever had a discussion about these proposed changes to 18C. I never sat my dad down and said, Dad, the government is changing the law on 18C. These are the specifics of it, because I thought I was going to waste his time. And the reason I thought it would waste his time is my father feels the same way I do towards racism. That is so interesting. I can never make it more clearly, I can never get this across, that people aren't their politics. You hear someone sprout off vile things about one nation, and sometimes they'll be your best friend, and they're the ones that pick you up at 2 a.m. in the morning if your car breaks down, and they're the ones that grew up with you all the way through Braybrook. They're the ones who have never begrudged your literary success, and you think people really aren't their political views. My best friend and I feel the same way about racism.
Maxine, at the moment, the Racial Discrimination Act, it was criticised before the proposed changes on some grounds because of this use of the term offend. So the current Act, it says it makes it unlawful for someone to do an act that offends, insults, humiliates or intimidates someone because of their race or ethnicity. I mean, like, I get offended by a lot of things. I get offended by George Brandis talking about most things. But offence is a kind of a low bar. Do you think that the legislation is kind of okay as it is?
Look, I think, again, the law is always a matter of interpretation. So the question of whether or not this actually offends someone is always going to be interpreted by a judicial power or a group of people. And as Alice said, there's that thing of the kind of reasonable person. Is it likely to offend the reasonable person? And for me, I think, I guess to pick up on another point from your talk, Alice, that concept of people bring a whole history with them, so something that is unlikely to offend someone who hasn't had that kind of experience of genocide or hate speech against them. I think, in a way there are different bars for offence. And again, I think it goes back to that this is human rights legislation. It came out of Nuremberg, it came out of this idea that, offence can lead to vilification, vilification can lead to violence. These aren't things, I feel anyway, that are isolated. And I think, in a way, the higher you set the bar, the more chance there is that it's pushed.
Do you think that you can legislate for social change then? Do you think that legislation can actually raise the levels of people's behaviour?
I feel like often it's symbolic. It's about saying this is what we as a society would like to see or would not like to see. And I think that even if that doesn't lead to direct, immediate social change, it's really about kind of standing up and saying, look, we don't believe this is the way that we want to live in this country. And I think in that sense, it can affect social change.
Alice, what do you think about the relationship of legislation to social standards? Should it? Would you sort of advocate a more progressive?
Nick, all legislation reflects social standards. People think that legislation is neutral. It's to reflect laws and orders of society, but it always reflects a society in which we live, and we should definitely legislate for our aspirations and not to the lowest common denominator. So you shouldn't legislate so that no one has the right to be punched in the face just because they're speaking Thai or because they're black. You should always aspire towards this vision of society you hope to create. So when the Attorney General got up and said, you all have the right to be bigots, he wasn't telling us anything new. This is where people get mistaken in this whole argument. They think, whoa, we don't have the right to be bigots. You have the right to think hateful thoughts about another race. It's perfectly fine. You just don't have the right to act on them, and that's protected by legislation. Yeah.
One of the other criticisms of the Racial Discrimination Act as it stands is that it sets a different standard for racial discrimination than exists for example, sexual or religious discrimination. Do you have a view on different standards in legislation for, being women? You face sexual discrimination as well. Why do you think it's different that one be protected in a different way?
What do you mean it's protected in a different way, Nick?
There's less protections against sexual and religious discrimination than there are on racial discrimination.
Well, I've never exercised religious or sexual discrimination law, so I didn't know that. That was something I found out today. Maxine, what do you think about this?
Look, I think, again, it goes back to that kind of history, human rights law, genocide, the fact that race is something that often is the precipitator, racial differences, for such atrocity And I think, religion, yes, maybe to some extent, but sexism, I don't think it has that loaded history. I mean, we had 400 years of slavery, of people owning other people, and there have been so many genocides based on race that I think that's why we need that higher level of protection.
And we have other protections in law. For example, in relation to sexism, we have equal opportunity acts, we have domestic violence acts. All these specific laws add up to protect women, specific laws about, vilification add up to protect race. So that's where the Discrimination Act comes across. Maxine, can I ask you a question? Have you ever been vilified as a woman, as a person of religion or no religion, or as a person of a different colour? And which one was more prevalent for you?
Yeah. I think far more as a person of colour, as a black person, particularly in Australia.
Why do you think that is?
I think, my parents migrated here. They were both born in the West Indies. They migrated here in 1976, which was kind of several years post-White Australia policy. And I grew up in a kind of very white picket fence suburb. It was an absolute shock for people to see a black person on the street. And I remember my mum, if she saw another black person, would just sprint and get their phone number. They'd be at our house the next evening. And so I grew up very much with vilification as a day-to-day occurrence. And I think, in your speech, I think you're right, there was that period in the 80s where things seemed to be getting better.
At school, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And there seemed to be some type of awareness of vilification issues. But I think, it's, as a person of colour, I think being vilified because of that, it's so loaded. And I have this quote that I wanted to read out. It's a Nelson Mandela quote. And Nelson Mandela was asked what made him become a revolutionary. What was this one thing, if he could go back through his life, that kind of made him stand up for what he believed in? And he said, no epiphany, no singular revelation, no moment of truth, but a steady accumulation of 1,000 slights, 1,000 indignities, and 1,000 unremembered moments. And I think that's what racism is. You just have this kind of constant onslaught of tiny little things. And so when it gets to that point where you're actually vilified, you're experiencing that on top of a lifetime of these kind of slights. And I think that's why, for me, it's a completely different thing to experiencing sexism or anything else.
What did your community think you were when you were growing up? Did they think you were Aboriginal, or did they think you were from Africa, or what? Because if they had never seen a black person, you could be anything.
To be honest, I don't think there was much care. I don't think there was much interest. You were just kind of a random black person. I think I've been asked more in the last 10 years where I'm from than I was when I was a kid. But my parents also, they grew up in London. They had British accents, so there was also this strange thing of this family that kind of was very much Western, a Western family.
Do debates like this recent one about racial discrimination, do they serve to kind of reinscribe you said something interesting, Alice, that racism defines people. Do you find that debates about race reinscribe your own sense of your own race?
No, I think they open it up. We're allowed room to breathe and to actually breathe into our race and our culture. When I was growing up like Maxine, people thought I was Japanese or Vietnamese or, Korean. It didn't matter because they didn't know that much about Asia. And it wasn't because they were racist. It was just that they were ignorant and they didn't care what race you were as long as you made nice spring rolls on Multicultural Day. So we get to have a more nuanced perspective. And Chris, what I meant by racism defining a person is that a person isn't defined by the racism that they've experienced, but it makes your world smaller and smaller. And my parents became more fearful because of, they killed all the Chinese in Cambodia whenever they got the chance because the Chinese were seen to be the capitalists. Then in Australia, whenever they encountered racism, they said, this is a lucky country. There are just some silly people out there who are also quite dangerous because you grow up in Footscray and Braybrook, and some of the most racist people were people with mental illnesses. And it was a sad thing that when Jeff Kennett closed down the group homes for people with mental illness, a lot of them were living in communities and weren't well looked after, so they'd all go around the streets of Footscray and sometimes they would yell things out at you. So my father said, don't stray too far from the Retrovision store. It narrows the parameters of your world. You feel safe, but you know you can't go any further than what you're allowed to go. Do you feel the same way, Maxine?
Yeah, I think so.
That racism makes you small.
Yeah, I think it does. And I mean, I had a similar experience actually to what you had with your dad. You know, there are so many complexities. We presume that racism is a black and white issue or a black and brown issue, you know. And I had an experience, my grandparents migrated from the West Indies to London in the late 50s, and about must be the mid-90s, I was in England, and my grandma, you know, she listened to a lot of talkback radio. She was getting very elderly at that time, and they just opened the EU, and she was saying to me, these Polish people and these Eastern European people, they come here and they take our jobs, and they just, you know, and it was this kind of, you know, even when I said to her, what do you think people were saying about you? She said, no, that's different. That was, you know, different. And so there is this strange thing where people, I think discussions about race, they open up all of those nuances. You know, people assume sometimes that because you're from a particular background,
you identify.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, my father was the same when he heard all these terrorist boat people were coming in. I said, Dad, but most of your friends came here on boats. And he said, oh yeah, but they were good people. These guys, we don't know who these guys are. And Andrew Bolt tells us they're terrorists. Like,
Before we throw it open, we are at the Writers' Festival, so I kind of wanted to ask you, take a slightly different tack and just ask you about writing. How in your writing, when you both touch at times on, you know, issues of race and politics. I wonder if Maxine, do you try to make explicit political points in your writing?
I think.
Do you read it over as well for, like, subsequently to see what political message it might be sending or something like that?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm a political writer. That's the impetus behind everything I write. Not necessarily an overt political message, but it's my way of writing is kind of my way of digesting what's going on around me. And, you know, a lot of what's going on around me is this kind of stuff, you know, 18C stuff and terrorism and all of that kind of stuff. So it's not so much kind of saying, I want to make this political point. It's just that that's what interests me, I guess, as a writer, yeah.
There's nothing didactic about your work, Maxine. Like, your points come across clearly, but you're not hammering them in. That's what I love about your stories. And each character takes on a personality and a class and a cultural background of their own. But you told me recently that when you read reviews of your work, some reviews have said, how can she write about such a diversity of experience? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. My book is set in a lot of different places, my short stories. There's one story in particular that's set in Villawood Detention Centre. Deals with a young Tamil boy who's kind of travelled from Sri Lanka to Australia. And it's this really interesting thing, talking to interviewers and reading reviews, and that questioning of how, what entitlement do you have to write this story? But yet, in another story is set kind of in the deep south in Mississippi, with this really working class family, which is more outside of my experience than the asylum seeker. You know, I've worked in asylum seeker policy. I've worked in detention centres, and I find that really interesting. This kind of never being asked, how can you write a white character? How can you write a character set in the deep south when you've never been there? But always being asked really about the characters of colour and the telling of those stories.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because when Nam Lee's book, The Boat, came out, there was no story set that was political in Australia. So he wrote about his boat journey, he wrote about suicide bombers far in the world, and people said, wow, this man is a master of storytelling, he can inhabit so many voices. So do you think your critics are criticising the politics behind this asylum seeker story because it's such a loaded issue. They say, well, how does she know these things? She's not a Tamil, she doesn't have any right. Whereas the Deep South story people were okay with.
Yeah, I think there's such a reluctance in Australian writing, particularly in fiction, to just go those places, to explore things that aren't related to our direct experience. And I think that's a shame. It's a real shame because I think our literature suffers because of it.
Well, Alice, you edited Growing Up Asian in Australia, which was a series of other people writing about their experiences of growing up. Did that politicise you in a way?
Oh yeah, every story politicised me because every story was set at a different time. And so you had stories from, set in 1800s when Chinese Australians were not welcome. You had stories set near the start of Federation with great-great-great-grandparents like Kylie Kwong's. You had stories set in the middle of white Australia policy, John So, who went to school here. And then you had stories set in multiculturalism Australia, Benjamin Law's stories and his sister Michelle's and Diane Ewan's. So you saw the whole spectrum of Australian society through these individual stories of Asian Australians.
Does anyone have any questions out there? Sorry, there's a question up the front here. Just wait for the microphone, it's just coming around.
In your talk, you were discussing the idea of these immigrant communities that set themselves up in Australia and are perceived as remaining within their own community and not assimilating. Were you I kind of had a clarification and then a question. Were you suggesting that one of the main reasons why there is a sense of keeping to themselves is because of this narrowing of the world, which is a result of racism? Is that the explanation for that social interaction? Was that what you were?
That's an excellent question because it's partly that and it's partly many other factors. So I've lived overseas and I've lived in Asia before. And if you're an Australian or a German or American who goes and lives in China and you don't speak Chinese, you gravitate towards people who are closest to you, people who speak English, German, or, American English, people part of your culture. And you gravitate and you live in these gated communities, and the only Chinese people you'll see are the Chinese people who clean up after your children or the Chinese people who clean your houses. No one in China ever says, look at these Westerners, they keep to themselves in ghettos, they're just left alone. And so a Western person in that situation would never understand what it's like to be perceived to be living in an urban ghetto. Growing up in Braybrook, you don't deliberately ghettoise yourself. Firstly, all these refugees come and they're suffering post-traumatic stress. All they can think about, all they can talk about are people they've lost, people they've loved, how to get loved ones here. So they all gravitate together to share information. And after that, communities form, like communities in Footscray, Springvale, Box Hill, Dandenong, depending on what kind of community you have. And the more hostile you feel that your world is, so the more hostile you feel like your neighbours in Braybrook are, the more tightly knit you become. So it's a number of factors that contribute to this perception of migrants living in ghettos. It's not just a choice of their own, often it's a necessity. Yeah.
So I guess my question is, do you think in a perfect world there would be much more of an infiltration throughout Australian society and much more of a reconciliation between an immigrant community with the rest of Australia?
In a perfect world, yes. And Les Twentyman always says, why do they put the refugees and asylum seekers in the areas that are the poorest, the most hemorrhaging with crime, violence and unemployment? Why do they chuck them in Footscray, St Albans, Sunshine? Why can't they distribute them among other suburbs, Kew, Toorak, places like that? You could do things like that, if you had a policy, and that would firstly, that would lessen the hostilities, you'd lessen gang warfare, because you imagine all these poor working class people who barely can make it themselves or who are on third or second-generation welfare, and all of a sudden you've got crazy Asian immigrants moving in, and then you've got black people moving in. Of course there's going to be racial tension. So that's the inevitability of putting migrants in places that can't sustain them.
Thank you.
This one here, please. Thank you.
Hi, Alice, I thought it's really interesting to hear your personal stories about your dad and your uncle and their personal reactions in terms of your dad saying, oh, my mates who came by boat are great, but, you know, we don't know these other guys, and your uncle having the poster of Pauline Hanson on the wall, but still treating you with the same love and affection that he always did. I often think that the language of law does not do well at representing rights that are deeply personal, like human rights. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering whether you thought that there would be scope to challenge the way that legal drafting is done and legal writing is done, especially in areas of human rights issues such as racism or women's rights, to actually challenge the normative way that we do these things to better reflect the personal situation?
That's an excellent question, and that probably has been done with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all those covenants that we're signatory to. If you read those, declarations and covenant, you'll notice the language is very, very different from our own laws and our own legislation. It's clear, it's concise, and it's to the point. Everyone has a right to an education. Everyone has the right to work. You know, anyone with maybe a grade 3 or 4 education can understand these covenants. When you get down to the specific details of the law and legislative drafting, this is why, this is how lawyers stay in business. They have to make things complicated because otherwise anyone could kind of understand the law and represent themselves in court. Now this sounds so funny and some of you are laughing, but it's not that far-fetched because I have legal training. But from when I was 18 years old, this is a true story, my dad said, right, you're the law student, you know, I've got this employment problem, can you read the contract? And I'd say, Dad, I don't know this stuff. And he says, you're the only one in our community with legal training. So I trained myself to read employment contracts, and then when I was 19, I'd be representing him at VCAT and places like that. And I thought, this stuff is really, you know, you could really simplify it. It took me ages to simplify, and I finally understood it. And I realised, look, if a 19-year-old could help their dad with his retrovision business in VCAT, then surely the law could be less complex than it is. So that's how I feel about legislation and the law.
Thanks for both of your insights to this point, at least. I wanted to ask a question about the presence or absence of optimism. I'm a mother of 2 children in their late teens and early 20s, and the one thing that I think reassures me about the future of this country is watching their interaction with a whole raft of people from all different walks of life, from all different countries, all different backgrounds. And it took me to that this afternoon. I spent the afternoon up at the Immigration Museum, and there's a wonderful interview on film up there with a young guy who is of Cambodian Chinese background, was born in New Zealand but is now living in Australia. And he sort of asked the rhetorical question, where am I from? What's my cultural heritage? And my children don't really care. Everyone is what they are, where they, are on the day is what matters. They're interesting in their heritage and so forth, but my children and their contemporaries, it's not a matter of any great significance. They just sort of get on with it. And I wondered if you had a sense of optimism for the future because of that apparent emergence of an attitude that maybe is different from the way we've been before.
Maxine, you have a go at this.
Yeah, I definitely have a sense of optimism. I mean, I have 2 children, one of whom is in primary school, and I haven't seen him really experience the kind of things that I experienced when I was at school. And we live he goes to school in an area that's very close to Footscray, and there are kids from all different walks of life in that school. That's just the way it is. And I think you're right, there doesn't seem to be that angst about where people are from and whether they kind of belong here. So definitely going forward, I think there's hope for the next generations. Yeah.
Alice? You...
Well, I think Maxine said all that needs to be said.
I used to go to the footy, and I have to make a confession that I'm a Collingwood supporter, and
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much.
I was distressed until the last 10 years or so by what Collingwood supporters were saying about people of different colour or different race. And we had a president of the club and a captain of the club who weren't much different. It's clear that in AFL, that sort of behaviour and that sort of language is now absolutely rejected. It's on the same level as spitting in the opponent's face. And the crowd dobs in members of their own club and has them banned from the club. I'd like you both to think aloud for us about how it is that that's been so successful and so normative, and to consider there's something I wonder whether in fact that's more influential than the legislation. I don't mean that we don't need the legislation as it is. So would you think aloud about that, please?
Do you want to go first, Maxine? Are you a football supporter?
I'm not a great football fan, but I do feel like that type of cultural change, particularly in a particular sporting area or whatever, is very important. And it's more about, that kind of common desire that this isn't going to happen anymore. I mean, there have still been several high-profile incidents in the last few years that have occurred, which I think demonstrates that we're not 100% there yet. And I think, the way that the media has dealt with those incidents in the aftermath has not been fantastic. So I think that things are definitely changing, and I think, peer pressure can do a lot. It can often do a lot more than legislation can. People will always look to see what their contemporaries are doing and finding acceptable, and I think that's probably what's happened.
Well, I'm an AFL supporter. I support the Western Bulldogs, of course, having been born in Footscray. And football is wonderful. It has definitely done what legislation has failed to do. And I think that's because we're always talking about Australian identity, but nowhere do you get masses and masses and masses of Australians from all different classes. I'm not just talking about races, but classes interacting together as in a football match. And this is where standards of the community are formed. The Attorney General is always going on about reasonable standards of the community. We monitor each other, and Australians have this great knack for supporting the underdog, and secondly, this idea of fairness. This fairness permeates everything we do, from sports to, well, mainly sports actually, and so it's this idea of fairness and this idea of supporting the underdog which makes us not tolerate racism. And Maxine mentioned about the number of high-profile cases, which I find really heartening. The fact that they even got this enormous high profile, the fact that whenever someone calls someone a black something, the media are up in arms about it and a big fuss is made. It shows the Australian public, you can't say these things in public. It's just not done.
Thanks very much for everything. Now, this is a writers' festival. There's a brilliant writer from the Footscray Football Club, the Western Bulldogs, who writes beautifully. What's his name? Robert?
Bob Murphy.
Bob Murphy.
Yeah.
Now, he's a very good writer, and if people read him, they'll see the sorts of things we want our younger generation to follow. Now, why I'm a science person, we get blamed for not writing enough about science to the general public. I could turn it back to lawyers. Why aren't lawyers writing enough for Australians about human rights, how it affects us in Australia, in common language so we can understand it? Is the Monthly writing enough about these issues to educate us so that the next generation won't have to be just quiet and internal and keeping to themselves, but can become leaders themselves and can engage in the same sort of way? What are the writers doing? You mentioned one who's brought up the issues, Christos. Tim Winton's another.
Yeah,
But
and they're
what
all
can
being
the
published in the
journals do?
monthly. Thank you for that opportunity to plug my magazine. We have a large essay in the coming issue written by David Marr about freedom of speech, and he investigates in sort of forensic detail the relationship of the Abbott government to this freedom of speech issue. It's a really interesting one. And look, I think your point about legal language and people writing to explain it is a really good one, and it's something it's a real gift for someone to be able to speak about their area of expertise in common language. And I would say that about every issue, I think. But I think, look, Alice has written a fantastic piece about this legislation in the monthly a few months ago, which actually gave rise to this event. So rest assured we're working on it. But look, I just wanted to finish off. We only have a brief amount of time left, but it's all very well for us to say things are progressing well. You know, we're not quite there yet, but we are. But we're getting there. I wonder if I don't think the government has learned very much. I know that they learned that ethnic communities can kick hard, but I don't actually think they understand these issues so well. And I'll tell you why. Because in the recent discussions about the terrorism legislation, Tony Abbott started talking about Team Australia, and he didn't understand that some people might not feel that they're part of Team Australia, or that there was a sort of defining element to the way that he used this term. And, you know, they can defend it all they like, but then he got up and he spoke, and people said, representatives from the Islamic community, he was asked about his meetings, and he immediately started speaking about Team Australia as we, and the Islamic community leaders as them. And it's always this way. It's them and it's we. And there was, to me, it was just this fundamental kind of linguistic giveaway. Do you think that they learnt anything? Do you agree?
Well, I think that's very deliberate. I think they've learnt to be more careful because they really want legislation like this to pass. The current political path of this government is that Team Australia to me sounds like euphemism for one nation. When you say Team Australia, of course you're either with Team Australia or you're against Team Australia. If you're against Team Australia, if you're what Tony Abbott calls a critic of this country, then you're someone who's uncooperative, because a team works together. And you know, it's really careful, really loaded language. You listen to the news and you think nothing of it, but it really permeates. It's a very clever way of saying what Pauline Hanson said, you know, about 2 decades ago, and he's learnt the lesson. So now they've dressed it up as Team Australia. Do you reckon, Maxine?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, the one, I guess, positive thing I feel that came out of the whole 18C is that, and I've always kind of spoken about this with friends, is that there are so many people of colour in Australia, you know, Indigenous people, Muslims, and this was one instance where not just white Australians, but entire communities all came together and said, this is going to affect us, you know. And I think that was probably quite an unnerving thing, you know, to have the Muslim community, the Jewish community, the African community all come together and say, look, we're not going to stand for this.
They still tried to pin it on the Muslim community.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. That's why they announced the new terrorism campaign right after they abolished this. They said, we won't focus on this and these small vocal minorities in the community because we're dealing with larger terrorism. And they used the same term, Team Australia, in their, repeal of this, Team Australia in their speech about terrorism. So yeah, it's very propaganda.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but I'd just like to make a note that Maxine got off the flu-y sick bed to come here. It's a remarkable performance. Thank you so much, Maxine. And please thank also Alice Pung.